What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be going through my updated Week 12 top 40 wide receiver rankings. If you guys enjoyed the video, hit that like button, subscribe. Any questions, feel free to drop them down below. But let's just dive right into the rankings here. Not going to spend a ton of time talking about these guys in Tier 1. You know you're going to be firing them up in your lineup. We have Amon-Ra St. Brown going up against the Colts, Nico Collins going up against the Titans, Justin Jefferson against the Bears. We have the Rams wide receivers, Puka and Cooper Kupp, going up against the Eagles. And then we have A.J. Brown going up against the Rams. These are your studs. You're going to be starting them regardless of matchup. Now, moving into Tier 2, going to start off this tier with Tyreek Hill, and he has been pretty disappointing. Even with Tua back, he definitely has not been giving you like that high-end wide receiver one production. When you drafted him, you were pretty much expecting like 20 plus points per game. He's only at 16.4 with Tua as the starting quarterback, so not great, but what are you going to do? You're still playing 16 points per game. He's still going to be in your lineup here as a wide receiver one. Then I have Malik Neighbors going up against the Buccaneers. Pretty interested in seeing how Tommy DeVito looks at quarterback. I don't really think it's going to be a massive shift from what we saw from Daniel Jones, but I really like this matchup here. So even though Neighbors hasn't been as great since coming back from his concussion, the Buccaneers are allowing the sixth most points per game to the wide receiver position. He's been commanding volume. I think this is a fine spot for Malik Neighbors. Then I have Mike Evans in that same matchup, expecting him to return from his hamstring injury. And I do think Mike Evans can be a really nice player down the stretch here. We've seen Baker, even with Godwin and Evans out, he's still racking up the passing volume. As the clear number one wide receiver, I think he's going to get a lot of volume. He's still on that push to get to 1,000 receiving yards. I think he needs like 6 something in his last 7 games. So I think he's going to be pushing for that. I think Mike Evans will be a wide receiver one rest of season. Then just a couple more guys in this tier. We have Terry going up against the Cowboys. His week 11 was like his first down game since I think like week 2. He had been super consistent. One, rough game isn't going to be, something that pushes me away from playing Terry McLaurin. And then the last guy is going to be DK Metcalf, coming off a knee injury, had a very respectable 7 for 70. Not super scared of this matchup here against the Cardinals. Now looking at tier 3, going to start off with Zay Flowers going up against the Chargers. For the most part, he's been pretty boom bust aside from I think week 1 and then last week in week 11. Chargers matchup isn't great, but I think this Ravens offense will put up points. I think he'll be fine. Then I have Cortland Sutton going up against the Raiders. Didn't have the greatest start to the season, but has really been on a tear over the last 4. 14 plus PPR points, 39 total targets in those last 4 games. Also really not scared of this Raiders matchup. Him and Bo Nix really over the last 4 have been a very impressive tandem. Then I have CeeDee Lamb going up against the Commanders. It's always tough to rank these talented wide receivers in bad situations. We saw early on this season an example of Tyreek Hill where his production just completely plummeted. CeeDee Lamb's hasn't been the same. He put up 6 for 21, then 8 for 93. I think the main concern here is just the touchdown upside is very limited. His ceiling is going to be low. He's still getting targeted a ton, 22 targets in 2 games without Dak. But we've seen that this offense can and has looked really bad with Cooper Rush at the quarterback spot. So I think this high-end wide receiver 2 range is a fair spot for him. After CeeDee Lamb, going to be going with Ladd McConkey. McConkey's someone who I've kind of had my eye on all season. I think I talked about him as a buy low at some point. He had been productive. He had been efficient. He just really wasn't getting the volume. This wasn't a super high volume Chargers passing attack. They were super run heavy. They weren't letting Herbert go out and sling it early on in the season. That has really shifted pretty much ever since their bye week, which was like, I think, week 4, week 5. Herbert's been racking up the passing volume. Ladd McConkey's had some big games, hasn't been super consistent, but he's coming off a week 11 where he went 6 for 123. Now he's drawing a really strong matchup here against the Ravens, who've allowed the most fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. This does seem like a smash spot for Ladd McConkey, and I do think he's going to come away with a big game. Then I have Juwan Jennings going up against the Packers. This is something that I talked about in my video earlier in the week, but I guess, for this specific week and probably rest of season, I'm making the claim I think Juwan Jennings is going to be the wide receiver 1 here. We've seen when either Deebo Samuel or Brandon Ayuk has been out, he's gone out and had these big games. In his last 2, he's gone 7 for 93, 10 for 91 and a touchdown, 11 targets in both of them. So he really has stepped up. That's not even talking about like the nuclear game he had when Deebo missed early on in the season. and it was just him and Ayuk. So I know Ayuk and Debo, they had been the guys who have been super productive. They have the strong fantasy seasons. But I think in the sample size from this year, like, how do you not view Juwan Jennings as the top wide receiver? So he's going to be my wide receiver 16, and as you can see, ahead of Debo Samuel. Then I'm going to have JSN going up against the Cardinals. And we may, be starting to see JSN really take that leap. Wasn't great as a rookie, wasn't terrible, had target competition, but really didn't break into the wide receiver room like you would have liked to see. And then heading into year 2, you thought, he could take that jump. Tyler Lockett getting up there in age. And he did kind of step into that wide receiver 2 role, but the production hadn't been great. Then we saw in week 9, DK Metcalf is out. He goes nuclear, 7 for 180, 2 touchdowns. The big question was, would he be able to, continue putting up those big numbers when DK Metcalf returned? I'm going to be honest, I was kind of skeptical of it. And week 11, they had a week 10 bye. Really nice game, 10 for 110. The volume was there, getting over 100 yards. It's good to see. Hopefully he can continue doing that moving forward. And then the last guy in this tier is going to be Josh Downs. I did think Richardson at quarterback would be a concern. His first 2 games with Richardson at quarterback were not great, but his last 2 have been very solid. 22.2, 19.4 PPR points. Also a nice matchup here against the Lions, who are allowing the 8th most points per game to the wide receiver position. Now looking at tier 4, going to start off this tier with Calvin Ridley. Over his last 4 games, he is averaging 17.5 PPR points per game. He's getting funneled with targets. He's clearly, their top weapon offensively. So I think ranking him in this like mid-tier wide receiver 2 range with all the teams on bye is a fair spot. This next guy, Devonta Smith, no guarantee he plays this week. He's missed a couple of practices with his hamstring injury. Also, probably lower than he'd be ranked normally just based on his last couple of performances. Last 2 games, 10.3 total points. Had been someone who was super consistent early on. That has not been the case. Now you also factor in the injury. I'm not feeling great about Devonta Smith, but hopefully he is able to give it a go. Then we're going to have Marvin Harrison Jr. going up against the Seahawks. He really has been like the definition of boomer bust. He has 5 games with 15 plus points. He also has 5 games scoring under 6. So the floor is not great. He's not getting a lot of free touches. Like he's not getting force fed like another rookie, like a Malik Neighbors type. But he does have the upside for some of those bigger games. Not super scared of the Seahawks matchup. Hopefully out of the bye, him and Kyler have something clicking here. Then I have Debo going up against the Packers. Talked about how I will have them below Juwan Jennings. He's averaging 10.4 points per game in the 3 games without Brandon Ayuk. That's not great. I do think he's going to be better, right? We have, seasons of him being very productive, a solid fantasy option, but with CMC back, Kittle balling out, Juwan Jennings now, stepping into a more significant role, I'm just not sure what the ceiling here is for Debo, and he hasn't really made the most of his opportunities with no Brandon Ayuk. Then I have Jayden Reed going up against the Niners. This is definitely something I honed in on in the earlier in the week video. He had a 60% route participation in week 11. I was kind of starting to talk about his route participation before their bye week, but I think he was dealing with an ankle or a hamstring. So, you could have kind of attributed the routes to that. At this point, it seems like his role is kind of diminishing here. Now, I don't think he's going to go much lower than that, but even playing as the wide receiver 3, you would like to see more 3 wide receiver sets. When he gets the ball in his hands, he is producing, he's getting to the end zone, he's very efficient, but 60% route participation, even for someone with the explosives and the touchdown upside of Jayden Reed, that's still not a number you want to be at. So something to definitely monitor moving forward. And then the last guy in this tier is going to be J-Mo going up against the Colts. I talked about Marv as a boom bust. J-Mo is definitely a boom bust also. Coming off a really nice game though in week 11, 4 for 124 and a touchdown. The big question is just can he rip off a big play? This Lions offense is rolling, so I do think more often than not, he's going to be a decent start in your lineup. Now looking at tier 5, going to start off with DJ Moore going up against the Vikings. On paper, it's a good matchup. The Vikings are allowing the 3rd most points per game to the wide receiver position. We did see this offense kind of have a bounce back in week 11. Would still view him as the wide receiver 1 here. Hopefully that's something they can carry into week 12. Then I have Tank Dell going up against the Titans. Moved him up a few spots. I think I had him as an honorable mention in my last video. He's been targeted 7 or more times in his last 3 games. I'm a believer in the player. The production hasn't really been there this season. but hopefully he can start to improve. Nico Collins back. They can get back to what they were doing last season with CJ Stroud. Then I'm going to have Jacoby Myers going up against the Broncos. He's coming off his worst game since week 2. He had actually been a very productive wide receiver with no Devontae Adams, pretty safe floor. The Surtain matchup is kind of scaring me here. Don't feel great about it. That's why I'm lower on him than I would be normally. And then the last guy is going to be Quentin Johnston going up against the Ravens. Like I talked about with Ladd, they're averaging the most points per game allowed to the wide receiver spot. He has scored 6 touchdowns in his 7 healthy games. He's getting into the end zone. Obviously, has Justin Herbert at quarterback. Fine, like mid-tier wide receiver 3 option. Now moving into tier 6, we're kind of getting into like the area where these players feel a little bit gross. You're kind of hoping for, a boom game out of these guys. We're going to start off with the Chiefs wide receivers, DeAndre Hopkins and Xavier Worthy. And I think people are going to think that D-Hop is ranked too low here. He is not like playing a full wide receiver workload. I don't know what the issue is here. He's 4 games into his run here with the Chiefs, and he really is just not improving in that area. Only a 53% route participation. Like, that is not good. We want 80 plus, and he's sitting around 53%. He had the one big game, but he's played 4 total games here. He has scored under 10 PPR points in 3 of them. It's not great, and I'm wondering if they're in this spot where they're like, we have a solid record. He's a veteran wide receiver. We want him healthy for the playoffs, and maybe they're just kind of going to limit him rest of season. I don't know what the ultimate answer is here, but all I know is that the usage has not been great through 4 weeks. And then I have Xavier Worthy. Week 11 was actually his best game since week 1. It pretty much all came on one drive. I'd say the most disappointing thing here for Worthy is just the lack of connection on the deep shots. It seems like anytime there's an accurate throw near the sideline, Worthy is like incapable of getting his feet down. And then anytime he's open not near the sideline, he just gets like way overshot by Mahomes, which is tough to do for someone with the speed of Worthy. So hopefully they can come together and, get that fixed moving forward, but it definitely hasn't been great. It seems like nearly every week there's like a just missed touchdown, which, obviously adds up because he goes from pretty much being unplayable to being a nice option if they can start hitting on those plays. Another rookie here, Roma Dunze, going up against the Vikings. Like I talked about with DJ Moore, solid matchup, starting to string together some solid games, 12 plus in 2 of his last 3. Then I have Demario Douglas going up against the Dolphins. In his 4 healthy games with Drake May, where they've both been playing, both healthy, he has scored 9 or more PPR points in all 4. Not a super high bar, but in PPR leagues, seems to have somewhat of a floor. Then we have the Packers wide receivers, Romeo Doubs, Christian Watson. Romeo Doubs had been the guy the last 4 or 5 weeks. Christian Watson with the monster week 11 on, not a huge target share. I think the way I'd look at these two, I'd say Romeo Doubs is probably the more consistent play with the higher floor. I'd say Christian Watson is the higher ceiling guy, the one that can really just give you that nuclear performance, both back-end wide receiver 3s. And then the last guy in this tier is going to be Jordan Addison going up against the Bears. He has straight up just been touchdown or bust this year. I believe he has 3 games where he's gotten into the end zone. He has scored 10 plus in all 3 of those. When he's not getting into the end zone, he's not getting that big play. The production just is not there. And then the final tier, tier 7, getting into our wide receiver 4s. I have Xavier Legate going up against the Chiefs. Not a great matchup. He has scored 13 or more points in 2 of his last 3 games. Has done a good job getting into the end zone. The issue is how much touchdown upside does this Panthers offense really have going up against the Chiefs? Then I have Wan'Dale Robinson going up against the Bucks. Like I talked about with Neighbors, it's a nice matchup. They're allowing the 6th most points per game to the wide receiver position. He's been a solid volume play, but the production has definitely fallen off as of late. Then I have Rashad Bateman going up against the Chargers. He, in this range of wide receiver, has had some decent upside games. 15 plus points in 3 of his last 7. Not a super high floor, but someone who's proven to be fairly talented, can give you a big game potentially. Then I have Pittman going up against the Lions. This back thing, I kind of wish they would have just put him on IR 4 weeks ago because maybe he could be healthy back. Instead, he's continuing to play, but just not producing under 10 PPR points in 4 straight games. It's a good matchup, but I just don't really know how you trust him. And then Jalen Waddle, insanely depressing to have him ranked here at number 40. With Tua healthy, I think 6 teams on bye. The fact that he is ranked wide receiver 40 with how talented he is, what we've seen his first few seasons, It is sad, but the dude has not hit 10 PPR points since week 1. It's like every week he's finally going to have a big game. He's finally going to turn it around, and it just has not happened. So definitely a tough spot for Waddle. The vibes are definitely not great with him for fantasy. But that is going to wrap it up for my top 40 wide receiver rankings. If you guys enjoyed, do me a huge favor, hit that like button, subscribe. Any questions, drop them down below. Thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.